Working at McAllister Funeral Home, an old brick building tucked away in a forgotten corner of Evanston, Illinois, was never anyone's dream job. For me, it was just a way to pay the bills. I'm Joe Miller, the guy who embalms bodies, seals coffins, and on the really bad days, faces grieving families and tries to look empathetic. That morning, the place was as quiet as ever. I liked the silence, though sometimes it felt heavier than it should. The embalming room was cold, and the smell of formaldehyde clung to my uniform. So, when Thomas Whitaker's body arrived, I was already in autopilot mode. The report said he died of a heart attack. A middle-aged man with peaceful features, like he'd simply fallen asleep and never woken up. Margaret Whitaker, his wife, was a polished woman, the type who knew how to wear grief like a perfect mask. "I want something modest but tasteful," she said firmly. "It's what he would have wanted." I nodded and jotted it down without looking up. Part of the job. Grieving people say what they think they need to say, and you pretend to believe them. Preparing Thomas for the service wasn't much different from what I did every day. I dressed him in the suit Margaret had provided and settled him into the casket. The strange part came later, in the details. There were no typical signs of livor mortis on his back. His muscles weren't as stiff as they should have been. The family had chosen a closed casket, saying it was better that way for the kids. That didn't surprise me. Open caskets aren't always the best memory for the living. But there was something about Margaret that unsettled me. Her voice was too calm, her answers too precise. As I wrapped up the work, a smell hit me, something sweet and metallic, not normal at all. I paused just for a second. Then I felt a sharp sting on the side of my neck. I tried to turn, but my vision blurred before I could process what was happening. Everything went black. I woke up gasping. There wasn't enough air. My chest heaved, but the oxygen wouldn't come. The first thing I noticed was the wood smooth and cold, pressed against my forehead, chest, and knees. I was inside a coffin. Panic slammed into me like a hammer. My heart raced, and I tried to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. I pounded against the lid, but the space was too tight to get any leverage. My whole body trembled, and the air, so little air, was making me lightheaded. Slowly, pieces of memory came back. Margaret. Thomas. The sting on my neck. None of it made sense. They put me in here? Why? I tried to think clearly, but my head was pounding, and the air that was left smelled like old wood and something chemical. My muscles started to go limp. I'm not getting out of here. The thought echoed in my mind like a death sentence. The wood creaked. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but then I heard it again. Muffled sounds like voices. Distant but real. I tried to call out, but my body felt too heavy. I hit the lid again weakly, barely making a sound. Here was all I managed before I blacked out. When I opened my eyes, everything was blurry. A face hovered over mine, hands gripping my shoulders. "Joe, you're alive." It was Laura, Thomas's ex-wife. I coughed, sucking in air like I'd never breathed before. The ground beneath me was loose dirt, and the sky above was full of stars. "What?" My voice was barely a whisper. Laura helped me sit up. She was covered in dirt, her fingernails caked with it, her face twisted in a mix of anger and fear. "Margaret and Thomas. They tried to bury you alive." The words were too absurd to make sense. I shook my head, trying to clear the dizziness. "Why?" Laura pointed to Jacob, Thomas's young son, standing a few feet away with a look of confusion and fear. "He told me. Said his dad did something bad, and they were putting you in his place." I didn't understand, but I came to check. The truth was worse than anything I could have imagined. Thomas had faked his own death to cash in on the insurance money, and Margaret was in on it. Me? I was just the convenient replacement. Have you ever worked somewhere where the silence speaks louder than words? I do. My name's Travis Hale, and I'm an embalmer at Henderson & Sons Funeral Home, in a little town so small it doesn't even make the map. You'd think the scariest part of my job would be what I do to the body's cutting, draining, stitching. But it's not. The scariest part is what stays behind after they're gone. The funeral home has its own smell. Not death, it's subtler than that. A mix of formaldehyde, wilted flowers, and something metallic. The caskets are lined up like soldiers waiting for orders, and the fluorescent lights flicker every now and then like the building itself is breathing. That night, I was alone. Henry, the director, had left early, and the place was all mine. I was finishing up with a young man named Aaron, just 19 years old, head-on collision on an empty highway. His face looked almost peaceful, except for the jagged scar running from his forehead to his jaw. The family wanted an open casket funeral, so it was my job to make him presentable. It's an art, if you ask me, and a heavy responsibility. As I worked on his features, I felt that strange sensation, like someone was watching me. It's not uncommon in this line of work. Your mind plays tricks on you, especially after midnight. But that night, the feeling wouldn't go away. I'm not the type to scare easily. I grew up on ghost stories. My grandma used to say that the souls of the dead stuck around if they had unfinished business. But Aaron, he was just a kid. What kind of unfinished business could he have? Still, the chill running down my spine wouldn't let up, like the air in the room had thickened. I decided to check the prep room. Everything was where it should have been. The body was there, still as it was supposed to be. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, laughing at myself. Paranoia, I thought. Just the exhaustion talking. I went back to work, but as soon as I touched Aaron's face again, I heard it a low, dragging sound coming from the hallway. Old wiring, I told myself. Maybe rats. I grabbed my flashlight and went to investigate. The hallway was empty, but the feeling that something was off only grew stronger. It was like walking through a minefield without knowing where the mines were. Then I saw a shadow moving toward the display room. I followed it into the main display area. This was where the caskets were set up for families to choose from. The room was dark, except for a faint light coming from the ceiling. The silence was deafening, almost suffocating. I moved slowly, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. Then I noticed one of the caskets was open. I knew I'd closed all of them before starting on Aaron. My hands shook as I walked closer. When I looked inside, the air left my lungs. The casket was empty. My first reaction was logical. Someone had broken into the funeral home. A vandal, maybe, or someone messing with things they didn't understand. But my mind, always drawn to the darker explanations, whispered something else. Was it Aaron? I ran back to the prep room, and my heart nearly stopped when I saw the metal table. It was empty. I didn't know what real terror was until that night. I tore through the funeral home, checking every room, every shadowed corner, but Aaron was nowhere to be found. My whole body trembled, cold sweat dripping down my back, and my head throbbed with questions I didn't want answers to. Just as I decided to call the police, I heard the front door of the funeral home creak open. I froze. Every muscle in my body screamed for me to run, but I couldn't move. That's when I saw Henry walk in, calm as ever, like nothing was out of the ordinary. "Travis," he said, his voice eerily steady. "What's going on?" I stammered something about Aaron, the empty casket, the missing body. He looked at me with a mix of pity and something else. Something that made my skin crawl. "Travis," he said, stepping closer. "You need to remember something." "What?" My voice came out louder than I intended. He sighed. "You don't work here anymore. You never did. You're just one of the ones we're preparing." That's when I looked down at my hands. They were covered in something I hadn't noticed before, something dark, thick, and reeking of death. I looked back at Henry, but he didn't look human anymore. And then it all made sense. My name is John Mather. I worked for almost 10 years at Hart and Sons Funeral Home, an old funeral home tucked away in the small town of Clear Lake, Michigan. To many, it's a morbid job. To me, it was just a way to pay the bills. Until one cold November night, everything changed. Hart and Sons was at the end of a back road, surrounded by oaks so old they seemed bent under the weight of their own history. The building was a strange mix of faded brick and dark wood, smelling of disinfectant and pine wax. A place where silence seemed to breathe deeper than the living. That night, I was alone. It wasn't unusual. In fact, I liked working the night shift. Fewer interruptions. Just me, the embalming room, and the dead. The body had arrived earlier that afternoon. Linda Crowley, 34 years old, found dead in her home. Apparent suicide, but something didn't sit right. She had strange marks on her wrists, like someone had squeezed them hard. But what really made me uncomfortable was the expression on her face. It wasn't the usual stiffness of the muscles I was used to. It was fear. A fear so deep, it seemed to want to escape the body, even in death. I left her body in the cold storage while I prepared my tools. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly, casting long shadows down the hallways. The night dragged on, like always, until I heard the sound. It was a dull thud, coming from the storage room. It wasn't uncommon to hear creaks in the funeral home. The building was old and made strange noises. But this sound had a rhythm. Footsteps. I gripped my flashlight tightly and walked to the storage room. The air was colder there, almost freezing, like someone had left the freezer door open. I opened the door slowly. Nothing. Just metal drawers and silence. When I returned to the embalming room, I felt it, the weight. The feeling that something was wrong, terribly wrong. Linda's body wasn't on the table anymore. My first thought was practical. Someone had broken in. A vandal, maybe. But the funeral home door was locked, and I had the only key. I checked the security camera. Nothing. Just me, walking through the halls. Then I heard something else. A whisper, low and dragging, like a secret being spoken in fear. "Help. Me?" I froze. The sound was coming from the cold storage. My hands shook as I opened the steel door. Linda was there, lying in the top drawer, exactly where I had left her. But her eyes were open now, fixed on me. You need to help me." Her voice was rough, hoarse, but undeniably real. I didn't run. I didn't scream. Not because I didn't want to, but because something in her expression paralyzed me. She was terrified. And strangely, she seemed more alive than before. They're coming for me. They always come. The air around me grew heavy, like something invisible was squeezing me. And then I saw it. The shadows in the room began to move. Not ordinary shadows, but black masses that seemed to swallow the light. I ran for the door, but it wouldn't open. An invisible force held it shut. I heard Linda scream, a sound that still echoes in my head. When I finally managed to open the door, the scream stopped. I turned around, and she was gone. The embalming table was empty. The shadows vanished. When the police arrived, they didn't believe me. They said I probably panicked, that the solitude and exhaustion had gotten to me. But Linda's body was never found. I still work at the funeral home, but never again on the night shift. And every time I hear footsteps in the empty hallways or feel the air suddenly chill for no reason, I remember that night. My name is Rick Darrow, and I work at Westfall Mortuary, a small funeral home on the outskirts of Dresden, Maine. No one comes to Dresden by choice. It's the kind of place you only pass through on the way to somewhere better. But Westfall is always busy. The dead don't wait, and someone has to prepare them for their final goodbye. That someone is me. It was a cold November night when it all happened. The wet leaves stuck to the tires of my old Chevy as I parked along the side of the building. Westfall Mortuary was a Victorian mansion falling apart, with a facade that looked more like a B-movie set than a place for eternal rest. "Rick, we've got an urgent case," Don, my boss, said as I walked in. He was a thin, anxious man, always smelling of cigarette smoke and formaldehyde. 2 bodies came in. A road accident. "We need to get them ready before 8 in the morning." Don wasn't one to ask. He told me what to do. I grabbed my vinyl apron, tied my hair back, and walked into the embalming room. The first thing I noticed was the smell. It wasn't the usual odor of death. It was something heavier, acidic, that clung to your throat like old smoke. There were 2 black bags on the stainless steel gurneys. I opened the first one. A man in his 50s, his face marked by deep cuts, but nothing I hadn't seen before. The second bag was a different story. Inside was a woman, no older than 30. She had a frozen expression of pure terror. Not the usual stiff look death leaves behind, but something more visceral, like she had seen hell itself before the end. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, but there was something in her eyes, or what was left of them. They were wide open, dry, fixed on an invisible point, as if she were still seeing something. I tried to ignore the growing discomfort and started preparing the bodies. But then, as I adjusted the woman's face, something moved. Not much, just a slight tremor in her fingers. My heart raced. It wasn't the first time I'd seen a post-mortem spasm, but there was something different about this. "Don?" I called, but he was already gone, off smoking in the parking lot. I carried on. I cut open the chest to drain the fluids, but when the first drop hit the steel tray, I heard a sound, a low, raspy whisper, like a sigh coming from inside the body. I froze. I was alone, the heavy silence of the room swallowing me whole. Then the sound came again, this time clearer. It wasn't a sigh. It was a word. "Help." I backed away so quickly I nearly tripped over the instrument counter. I looked at the body, expecting something, but there was nothing. That's when I noticed the emergency phone on the desk by the morgue was off the hook. I picked up the receiver, thinking Don had forgotten to hang it up. "Help me." The voice came again, now coming from the phone. I dropped the receiver as if it were on fire. The sound of the line being cut echoed through the room. I ran to Don's office, but he wasn't there. The chair was overturned, and on the desk was a single sheet of paper, a life insurance policy signed by the man I had just prepared. But the amount didn't add up. It was astronomical, something that would only make sense if there was a very specific beneficiary, the woman. I turned back toward the embalming room, and the air seemed to grow heavier. When I entered, both bodies were standing. The woman was staring at me with those dry eyes, and the man had a twisted smile, as if he thought all of this was a big joke. "You shouldn't have come tonight, Rick," the woman said. Her voice didn't match her appearance. It was deep, gravelly, almost hoarse. I tried to run, but the man blocked the exit. Dawn was easier to convince. You, on the other hand. I looked back, expecting to see Dawn in the parking lot, but all I saw was the empty Chevy, still with the engine warm. The next morning, the police found the place empty. Neither Dawn nor I, nor the bodies were there. All that was left was the steel tray, still filled with dark liquid, and a note signed, "We all have a price."